Welcome to the San Fernando Valley Climate Reality Chapter meeting. This is our monthly chapter meeting, and we have a really important guest tonight that we look forward to sharing with you, Mark Z. Jacobson, and the author of No Miracles Needed. So we're very happy to have Mark tonight. Before we get to our program, we have a couple of announcements, and we always like to start with the land acknowledgement. And as I was saying, we encourage anyone in the chapter to reach out and say, oh, I'd like to give the land acknowledgement. And Kim, if you can just wave again, raise your hand so people can see you. That's great. She will be the one to schedule. So just pop into the chat and just say land acknowledgement, and she'll follow up with you. Okay. So Robert, thank you for doing this tonight. I am actually going to share my screen so that everybody can read along as you give the land acknowledgement. Robert?
A land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. It acknowledges the history that has brought us to reside on this land, the colonialism that is present in our current systems, and calls on us to be mindful of our present participation in it. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Tongva, the Kish, the Tataviam, and the Chumash tribes.
Thank you very much, Robert. And Robert is on our Sepulveda Basin Task Force and has been supporting our Sepulveda Basin project, which we'll talk a little bit about in a few minutes. So, so thank you for sharing that. And I know that some of you have heard of our guest tonight. And again, we're going to be coming back, but I want to just pop this link into the chat because if you go to Professor Jacobson's page, you will see a ton of his work, and you might want to just have that to come back to later or tomorrow, whatever, just to review. So I just want to make sure you have that. That's also in our agenda. I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, who has done such a great job in helping to organize this particular meeting and the book and leading the book club. So I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to introduce our special guest tonight. Michelle?
Thanks so much, Diana. Well, we're really excited to hear from Mark Z. Jacobson, who is a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford. His career is focused on air pollution and global warming problems and developing large-scale clean renewable energy solutions. He's developed and applied three-dimensional atmosphere, biosphere, ocean computer models to simulate and understand air pollution, weather, climate, and renewable energy systems. He's also developed roadmaps to transition countries, states, cities, and towns to 100% clean, renewable energy for all purposes. And he'll be speaking tonight about his new book, No Miracles Needed: How Today's Technology Can Save Our Climate and Clean Our Air, which describes how to solve the climate crisis and at the same time eliminate air pollution and safely secure energy supplies for all. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Mark Jacobson.
All right, thank you so much, Diana and Michelle, for a kind introduction. I'm going to just share my screen first. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Okay, good. So yeah, I'm going to talk about how we can solve the climate and pollution problems we face and energy security problems we face with no miracles needed. We have existing technologies that can be deployed on a large scale, and we have 95% of the technologies right now. So it's really primarily a question of just deployment at a large scale. So I'm really interested. I've been, well, interested since I was a teenager, traveling to Los Angeles and San Diego to play tennis back in the 1970s and finding that the pollution was so bad. I thought, why should people live like this? And I dedicated my education and then career subsequently to trying to understand and solve air pollution and also climate problems, and then through clean renewable energy systems. And so still today, I'm I'm looking at solutions that address both air pollution and climate. Worldwide, there are about 7.5 million people who die from air pollution prematurely each year. And based on statistical cost of life, that's about $30 trillion per year worldwide. Global warming is estimated to cost on the order of $30 trillion per year worldwide by 2050. And a third problem that I'm looking at is how to address energy insecurity. There are many types of energy insecurity, and one particular one is, well, fossil fuels are limited resources. They will run out at some point, and that will result in energy price instability and economic, social, and political instability as well. There are other types of energy insecurity, such as some countries relying on other countries for their energy. The fact that there are islands that require the transport of long fuels for over long distances. The fact that when you have centralized power plants, they're risky, and so having more distributed energy can reduce that risk. Anyway, these are all drastic problems, and they require immediate and drastic solutions. So our solutions have been, and we've been developing energy plans since 2009 to electrify pretty much everything you can and provide some direct heat for the rest, and where the electricity and heat comes from just wind, water, and solar. And that's onshore and offshore wind, solar photovoltaics on rooftops and in power plants, concentrated solar power, geothermal electricity and heat, some solar heat too, hydroelectricity, and some tidal and wave power. And so to do that, we would electrify transportation, going to battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. We'd electrify buildings, going to electric heat pumps for air and water heating and air conditioning, and also even heat pump dryers. We'd use electric induction cooktops instead of gas stoves, for example. And we'd also use some geothermal heat and solar heat directly. For industry, we would, for high temperature processes, we would go to electric arc furnaces, induction furnaces, resistance furnaces, dielectric heaters, electron beam heaters, and even heat pumps for some medium temperature processes. So these are all electric technologies that provide high temperatures. And they're also, for like emissions of carbon dioxide from cement and steel, for example, we would go to, in the case of steel, for example, instead of using coke to reduce iron ore to iron, we would use green hydrogen, which is hydrogen from clean renewable electricity. And that process, plus using arc furnaces, reduces about 98% of carbon from steel production. And for example, Sweden has already implemented a steel plant like that does this, and is implementing, in fact, all their steel plants, they're transitioning to green steel. For cement, ordinary Portland cement can be transitioned in two ways. One is with geopolymer cement, is an alternative that doesn't release any carbon dioxide from the chemical process. And you can then use renewable electricity for high temperatures for the cement production and for electricity. And another process is by converting, instead of using calcium carbonate, which is limestone, in cement, you use basalt, which has the calcium but no carbonate, so there's no carbon dioxide emissions from the chemical process. There's a company in Oakland that's doing this, and that together with renewable electricity for heat and electricity, you can go to 100% renewable cement. So there are options for pretty much everything, and I'll go into a little more detail later in some of these technologies. We will need storage for 100% wind, water, solar system. We need electricity storage, heat storage, cold storage, and also some hydrogen storage. So electricity storage options, well, hydropower, conventional hydropower is the biggest source of electricity storage in the world right now. In fact, as I'll show later, there are 9 countries of the world that are 98.5 to 100% wind, water, solar already in their electricity production, and they are primarily powered by hydropower. Pumped hydropower is the second biggest. And then batteries, though, are growing. In California, we already have 5 gigawatts of batteries installed, and the peak demand in all but summer is about 25 gigawatts. So batteries already meet about 20% of the peak demand, except for summer. And summer peak demand can go up to like 50 or 55 gigawatts. So we're about 10% in the summer. But batteries, that's just in 2 years, that's how much batteries have been added to California's grid. But there are all these other technologies: compressed air storage, flywheels, gravitational storage, even grid hydrogen using fuel cells, and concentrated solar power with storage. But we also need storage for hot and cold, because so water tank storage is the most common type of heat and cold storage there is in the world. But there's also ice storage for cold, and storing heat underground in boreholes, water pits, and aquifers. This is done in many parts of the world where you have district heating. And so you can store, the nice thing about underground storage of heat is that it's very inexpensive and you can store it for a long time. You can store it up for up to 6 months and recover the heat. So you store it in the summer, recover it in the winter, and that's what they do in some places in Canada and also in Scandinavian countries. Also storing heat in building materials. And then also hydrogen, which we'll use for certain applications, which I'll discuss in a second. The non-grid applications, that's a form of storage as well. So you've probably heard a lot about hydrogen. So I want to give you my opinion about what are the good and bad sources and uses of hydrogen. Well, there's only one good source of hydrogen. That's what's called green hydrogen, which is from electricity, where the electricity comes from just wind, water, or solar sources. And so you use what's called an electrolyzer to split water, and you get the hydrogen out of that. Now, and the other byproduct of that is oxygen. Now, bad sources of hydrogen are what are called gray or blue hydrogen. Gray hydrogen is hydrogen from natural gas without carbon capture. And 96% of all hydrogen today worldwide is gray hydrogen. Blue hydrogen, which hardly exists, is adding carbon capture to gray hydrogen. And really, you need to add 2 sets of carbon capture equipment because natural gas is used for 2 purposes when it's used to produce hydrogen. One is for the energy, and one is as the feedstock, because the methane in the natural gas gets converted partly to hydrogen and also to carbon dioxide. So you have 2 separate sources of carbon dioxide when you have gray hydrogen. And so you need 2 sets of carbon capture equipment. And you also need pipelines. And you need more energy, so you have to drill for more natural gas. So you have more natural gas leaks, more air pollution at the mining sites, and you have more air pollution at the site of the hydrogen production. And the carbon capture rates are not very low, not very high, as I'll show you. And then worldwide, 75% of all carbon dioxide that's captured today is used for enhanced oil recovery. And during that process, 40% of the carbon dioxide goes right back to the air. So as you can see, this is just not a useful technology. Black and brown hydrogen are from coal. Pink hydrogen is nuclear electricity. Turquoise hydrogen is from what's called methane pyrolysis. So it's also from natural gas, but it's a slightly different process. Anyway, the cleanest by far is the green hydrogen. So that's what we advocate for. Now, in terms of uses, really the only good uses of hydrogen are for long distance transport. So not for passenger vehicles or mid-sized vehicles. Not that they're not, even if you use green hydrogen for, let's say, a Toyota Mirai, which is a passenger vehicle, the problem is it requires 3 times the electricity to produce the hydrogen and use it than does using electricity just for a battery electric vehicle. So you need 3 times as many wind turbines, 3 times as many solar panels. So it's just not very efficient. However, it becomes more efficient when you use hydrogen for long distance transport, like a long distance aircraft, ship, train, or truck, or military vehicle. Another application that's good is ammonia production. You need hydrogen already for ammonia. So all we do in this case is just switch out the source of the hydrogen from gray hydrogen to green hydrogen. Steel manufacturing, as I mentioned, is another good use of hydrogen because it eliminates the use of coke for reducing iron ore to iron and helps to get steel production almost carbon free. And then using hydrogen together with batteries in some locations on the grid is helpful, but not on its own. So it's not as a substitute for batteries, but in conjunction with some batteries. And also when you have what are called microgrids, which are isolated grids in remote areas, you can use the hydrogen with the fuel cell to produce both electricity and heat. And so that's a good application. Not good applications aside from passenger vehicles is for to use it to heat buildings. You've probably heard of the natural gas industry is trying to mix hydrogen with natural gas in pipelines. It's a bad idea, not only because hydrogen is 1/8 the size of methane, so it just leaks a lot easier from the same pipelines as methane, which already leaks at about a 2 or 3% rate. But it's just much less efficient than electric heat pump. An electric heat pump in a home uses 1/4 the energy as natural gas or natural gas mixed with hydrogen. So your bill goes down substantially with electric heat pump. There's just no, and also you have air pollution in your home when you're burning natural gas in a stove or for fuel to heat your home. So same thing happens when you burn hydrogen. So that's not a good application. Well, why not other technology? I'm showing why it's good to use wind, water, solar, but why not carbon capture, direct air capture, small modular nuclear reactors, bioenergy, non-hydrogen electrofuels, geoengineering. So these are all what I call part of the all of the above policy that several US administrations have carried. And you've probably heard a lot about carbon capture. I should say that, well, first of all, there are four of these technologies. Four technologies are really driven by the fossil fuel industry. So they're constructs of the fossil fuel industry. They're designed by the fossil fuel industry to stay relevant and stay alive. These include carbon capture, direct air capture, blue hydrogen, which I just talked about, but also electrofuels, which are fuels to replace gasoline made of carbon dioxide from carbon capture combined with other organic chemicals, and requires a lot of energy to produce these liquid fuels to replace gasoline. They require huge amounts of energy, require carbon capture, which I mentioned is just not very useful, and they you still burn them and produce pollution. So, well, why not carbon capture in general? So carbon capture is used to take out carbon dioxide from the exhaust stream of a combustion source, let's say from a coal plant. And it takes a lot of energy to take carbon dioxide out of the exhaust stream. So for example, if you attach carbon capture to a coal plant, it takes about 25 to 30% of the energy of the coal plant, the electricity produced, to run the carbon capture equipment. So there's only been one carbon capture plant built in the US, that was in Thompson's, Texas, that was attached to a coal plant. And to run the carbon capture equipment, they actually built a natural gas electricity generating plant just to run the carbon capture equipment for the coal plant. So they spent $1 billion on this natural gas facility. They then had pipelines and mined natural gas. So there's more pollution and emissions from that. And there's leakage in the piping. And there's combustion emissions at the natural gas plant. None of that carbon or air pollution was captured or reduced. That was just an addition of air pollution to this whole system. The carbon capture equipment was added to the coal plant. Carbon capture equipment does not reduce air pollution from the coal plant. It just takes carbon dioxide out of the exhaust stream. But it required that extra energy from the natural gas plant. It turned out when you count it, and it doesn't stop any of the coal mining emissions. When you account for the coal mining emissions, the natural gas mining emissions, the natural gas power plant emissions, and the coal emissions that weren't captured, over a 20-year time frame, which is the relevant time frame for looking at these problems, I did a calculation and found that you're only capturing 11 to 20% of the carbon dioxide that's emitted from this whole system. And what did they use that carbon dioxide for? They piped it to a nearby oil field to dig out more oil, because the carbon dioxide binds to the oil, makes it less dense, so it floats to the surface faster. So for every ton of carbon dioxide, you get a few more barrels of oil, and then you burn that. But that process releases about 40% of the CO2 that's captured right back to the air. So when you account for that, then we're talking about a 6 to 11% capture rate. That was so inefficient that the plant, actually the carbon capture, was shut down after 3 years. It cost $1 billion, and who paid for that? Well, it's ratepayers, and which ratepayers pay the highest fraction of their income to electricity? It's low-income ratepayers. So this is just a tax on low-income ratepayers. That's all carbon capture is. Now, some people argue, well, why don't we use renewable electricity to power carbon capture equipment? Well, that's no better, because what happens is you then have to compare using that renewable energy just to replace the coal plant. And it turns out that if you use the same amount of renewable electricity to run the carbon capture equipment as to replace the coal plant, you can actually reduce more CO2 just by replacing the coal plant. And when you replace the coal plant, you eliminate the air pollution, the mining of the coal, and the infrastructure. You don't do any of that with the carbon capture equipment. So there's no benefit whatsoever from using carbon capture, and that is for any purpose. It only increases carbon dioxide, because you're preventing renewable energy, in the best case, from replacing a fossil source. And it's always better to replace a fossil source than use renewable energy to run carbon capture equipment. And so and not only that, the social cost benefit of using renewables to replace a fossil source is on the order of 5 times to 10 times higher than the social cost of using that renewable for carbon capture. So don't let anybody fool you that there's any kind of good carbon capture. This applies to direct air capture also, where you take carbon dioxide directly from the air. It's the same thing. It needs energy. Even if that energy is renewable, it's always more efficient to use that renewable energy to replace a fossil plant and then eliminate the air pollution, the mining, and the infrastructure from the fossil plant, as well as more CO2 than you're going to suck out of the air. So you're always increasing CO2 with direct air capture. And I already talked about blue hydrogen and non-hydrogen electrofuel, same thing. Bioenergy, it's also a big scam. Don't believe it. It's not, you burn biofuels. And I'm going to show you an example in a second of how bad this is. But your bioenergy, you can use it for liquid transportation fuels like ethanol when it's added to vehicles, or there's biomass that's used for electricity generation. In both cases, you're burning fuels and you're creating air pollution. Living in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, you know that air pollution is the worst in the country. And we don't want anything that exacerbates that air pollution. I mean, I lived in Los Angeles for 5 years in West LA, and it was horrible back then when I lived there. In fact, I was doing experiments on the top of the UCLA buildings to see how far we can see on certain days, and literally we could not see the next building just because of air pollution. And this is how bad, in fact, the picture down below, at the bottom of this slide, you can see this is a picture I took offshore of San Pedro earlier this year, and you can see the air pollution is still horrible. It's still it's unacceptable types of air pollution. So this carbon capture, direct air capture, bioenergy all worsen this air pollution. We need to go to electrification and clean renewable sources. Now, small modular reactors, well, large reactors, there's only one reactor that has been built in the United States in the last 20 years, just was activated in Georgia, the Vogtle plant. It cost, for 2 reactors, it cost $35 billion for 2.2 gigawatts. That's $15.6 per watt. New wind and solar are less than $1 a watt. And it took 17 to 18 years between planning and operation of those plants. New wind or solar takes 1 to 3 years. So you're spending like 15 times more capital cost per kilowatt of electricity per installed kilowatt of electricity generation, and it's taking 15 years longer. And in terms of the levelized cost of energy, it's about 7 to 8 times more. Small modular reactors, they're not even supposed to be around commercially until maybe 2030. They're not expected to be any better. I mean, we used to have small modular reactors before we went to large reactors. And the reason we went to large reactors because of it was cheaper to go to bigger reactors. Now, for some reason, people think it's cheaper to go to small reactors, but we have the same problems of weapons proliferation risk, meltdown risk, waste issues, and underground uranium mining risk. And there's 9 to 37 times the carbon dioxide equivalent emissions from nuclear compared with wind. So it's just not an option. We have 7 years to solve 80% of the climate problem and no years to solve the air pollution problem. We can't spend money on things that might or may not be available in those 7 years. I mean, if you have a technology, it takes 17 years between planning and operation. If you plan it today, it won't be ready till 2040. That's way past the deadline we need to have solved 100% of the problem. So nuclear is just a useless technology, has no hope whatsoever of helping us gain any advantage in this climate problem solution. So let me just show you some data on carbon capture, just efficiencies. I mean, I told you how the overall system, just need a lot of energy. This shows just the efficiency of carbon capture. The fossil fuel industry tells you that they can capture 95% of the CO2. Well, in an ideal situation, that might be true, but in reality, carbon capture equipment is often shut down. It needs repairs. Sometimes there's no use for the carbon dioxide, so they have to shut the pipelines. Anyway, these are the real data from actual carbon capture projects. And you can see that the range of actual capture efficiency is from like 32% to 80% at the best. But most of them are on the order of the median's around 56%. So this is nothing close to 95%. And by the way, the Gorgon project, which is the 32%, that's the largest carbon capture project in the world. So that's also the worst capture efficiency. What about capture from ethanol refineries? So there's been a proposal in 5 states in the upper Midwest, Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, to build a network of pipes, 2,000 miles of pipes, connected to 34 ethanol factories, where they're producing ethanol for flex fuel vehicles. Well, some gasoline vehicles that have some ethanol added, and some what are called E85 vehicles, which is 85% ethanol, 15% gasoline. I did an analysis looking at, well, so there's one company is proposing to spend $5.6 billion on the capturing carbon from the ethanol refineries and then piping it to an underground facility in Bismarck, North Dakota. So first, notwithstanding the fact that they have to invade thousands of homeowners' lands to build these pipes underneath the ground there. And in fact, South Dakota, North Dakota, the Public Utilities Commission this week actually denied the permits for this, temporarily at least, because it was so much opposition by these landowners. But what if you took that $5.6 billion and instead invested in wind turbines to power battery electric vehicles instead of E85 vehicles? So here's a comparison, what happens. Because first of all, well, Ford has an F-150 flex fuel vehicle that runs on E85 and an F-150 battery electric vehicle. So you can do an exact comparison. Turns out the battery electric vehicle is similar, except it's more expensive. It costs about $20,000 more. But the nice thing about electric vehicles is they use much less energy to drive a vehicle the same distance. So in the case of these two vehicles, which can be compared exactly, the electric version drives 3.7 times further on the same energy. That doesn't mean it has this 3.7 times the range. It just means for the same energy input, it's 3.7 times further. So if you actually compare, but the electric vehicle, the other difference is there's no carbon dioxide or air pollution coming out of the tailpipe of the electric vehicle. Whereas from the flex fuel vehicle, you have air pollutants that are similar to gasoline. In fact, I've done another study on that, but you also have CO2 coming out of the tailpipe. And you have CO2 that's emitted during the processing of the ethanol from corn. So you have to grow a lot of corn, you fertilize it, you water it, you cultivate it, you transport it to an ethanol refinery, then you refine it to E85. And that all takes a lot of energy. And so they want to capture the CO2 from the fermentation process of the ethanol refineries, which is a relatively pure stream. But so they don't really have to separate the CO2 out from anything. So that's an advantage, but you still have to compress the CO2 to put it in a pipeline. And that takes about 15%. That results in about 15% of the CO2 going back to the air. But the thing is, so on the left here, I have a comparison of the cost, and on the right, the comparison of the CO2 emissions of two plans. One is this ethanol plan where they spent $5.6 billion on the pipelines plus the ethanol refinery. And so that's what that blue negative number is, minus $5.6 billion. And on the right, well, on the same graph, those two are wind plan A, low value, and wind plan B, high value. These are the so it's this is the cost benefit. No, this shouldn't be the cost. It's really the cost benefit of using wind to power battery electric vehicles. So the red shading is the cost savings of fuel, because you're using 3.7, your electric vehicle goes 3.7 times further, so you need a lot less energy. And so if you compare the cost of electricity for a battery electric vehicle versus the cost of ethanol, and you multiply by all the vehicles that would run when you buy enough wind turbines with $5.6 billion, the red is all the cost savings. So you'd get a cost savings of, just from fuel cost savings alone with the wind plan, between 33.9 to from 39.5 to $65.6 billion over 30 years. So you save a huge amount in fuel costs. The blue is the net input of the $5.6 billion for the wind turbines, and then the yellow is the higher cost of the vehicles. But if you just subtract the negative numbers from the positive numbers, the net savings you get with using wind instead of ethanol is between 34 and $60 billion over 30 years. So in other words, going to ethanol with pipelines and carbon capture, that saddles consumers with high energy costs, fuel costs for 30 years. You just save huge amounts of money by going to an electric vehicle. It's just a fact. Same thing in Los Angeles. If we all went to electric vehicles, then we're going to save huge amounts of money in fuel costs. I mean, it's about 80 cents a gallon equivalent to drive an electric vehicle versus $4 or whatever a gallon to drive a gasoline vehicle. So you can imagine, multiply that difference, $4 minus 80 cents, by the number of miles per gallon and the gallons per year, and over 15 or 30 years, and you'll see how much money you save in fuel costs. And that's what's going on here. Now on the right, also it shows that the ethanol plan is only going to save, just like due to the carbon capture, you only save about 8 million metric tons per year, whereas using wind to power battery electric vehicles, you save between 20 and 33 million metric tons per year. So it's a lot more CO2 savings, a lot of money savings using wind for electric vehicles instead of ethanol with carbon capture for flex fuel vehicles. And also the land use, you use 1/10 to 1/20 the land with the wind plan, and you have less air pollution. So it's a no-brainer to not use carbon capture. This is another point I'm trying to make, is that carbon capture is just not useful for any purpose whatsoever. It's an opportunity cost. Okay, so let me jump to transitioning an individual home. In 2017, I built a new home. I was fortunate to be able to do that. And I made it all renewable. So it has 13.6 kilowatts of solar on the roof, 4 Tesla wall mount batteries, first generation, in the garage. And then in electric vehicles, also electric heat pumps, called ductless mini split heat pumps for air heating and air conditioning. And so with these, there are no ducts, but you have an inside unit, like on the left in each room, and then 2 outside units. So there's 9 inside units and 2 outside units. So 5 inside units are connected to one and 4 to the other outside unit. And heat pumps, they use 1/4 the energy as natural gas for heating. And they're very efficient. They move heat around. They don't create it. So that's why they're so efficient. But they've worked perfectly in the last 6.5 years and saved a huge amount of money. I also have a heat pump water heater to heat the water. And there's, again, no natural gas here. And in this case, the heat for the water heater is extracted from the room that this water heater sits in. So the room temperature drops a couple degrees. It's not cold, it's just cooler. So you can open the door in the summer and you create extra air conditioning. But it works perfectly. Never had any problems with this heat pump water heater. It heats, up to 140 degrees. I think 100, it could be even higher, 145 degrees if necessary, but that's way too hot. But it works perfectly fine. For stove, I use an electric induction cooktop. This uses about 40% of the energy as a natural gas stove, because it boils water and half the time is natural gas as a result, because most of the energy is concentrated. The way an electric induction cooktop works is that there's electric current in each of these little circle areas, and you put a pot on it that has a stainless steel or iron base that's highly resistant. And that electric current induces a current in the base of the pot. And because of the resistance in the base of the pot, that electric current dissipates to heat. And so the heat comes from the pot or the pan itself, not from the stove. And so as a result, you can put your face on the stove while you're cooking and you won't burn your face. Not recommending that, but I'm just saying it can happen. And anyway, it cooks really fast and evenly, and a lot of people like it. One of these individual burners, you can find them on Amazon for anywhere from $30 to $80. So you can even, if you're in an apartment and you just want to get one burner and cook, because that's what a lot of people just need is one, you can just get one for $50 and it works perfectly fine. This is really good for developing countries because of the 7 million people who die each year, 2.5 million are in developing countries who die from indoor burning of biomass and coal for cooking and heating. And so trying to eliminate using burning combustion cooking is really important for saving people's lives in developing countries. And this is one solution. Well, over the first 5 years, I generated 120% of all my home and vehicle energy use. I had no electric bill, gas bill, or gasoline bill. And for the extra electricity I generated, I sent it back to the grid and got paid an average of $860 per year from Silicon Valley Clean Energy, which is the community choice aggregation utility that I subscribe to. And in addition, I avoided gas hookup fee of $6,000. This shows ranges for typical homes of $3,000 to $8,000. I avoided gas pipes of about $10,000. I avoided the electric bill, gas bill, and gasoline bill. So a total of $5,000 to $23,000 up front is your typical savings, plus $3,000 to $10,000 per year. The whole system paid itself off. When I say the whole system, the solar plus battery system paid itself off in 5 years with subsidies that I received, but without subsidies, it would be 10 years. But the solar system is warranted for 25 years. So it's free energy for the next basically 19 years. So anyway, this is really, we can do this today. And I recommend everybody who can, next time you have to replace something, get an electric version, heat pumps, induction, even LED lights. This shows the hottest day of the year in 2020, September 6th. On that day, I kept the indoor temperature at 77 degrees. The outside temperature is 106 degrees. The green is the solar generation that day. The blue during the day is the solar and electricity being used for mostly cooling, air conditioning. And after sunset, the blue is from the batteries kicking in. The red is grid electricity kicking in. But on that day, I generated 60 kilowatt hours and I consumed 45 kilowatt hours. So I sent an extra 15 kilowatt hours back to the grid on the hottest day of the year. This is how you would avoid a blackout in California, by more and more people having rooftop solar and also using efficient appliances like heat pumps and electric induction. Okay, so let's move to talk about how to transition the whole world to 100% clean renewable energy and storage. So we developed roadmaps for 145 countries, and this kind of summarizes some statistics. In 2018, the end-use demand for all energy in these countries, and these countries represent about 99.7% of all world emissions, was 13.1 trillion watts. That demand is expected to go up to 20.4 trillion watts in 2050. But if we electrify everything and provide the electricity with wind, water, solar, the demand goes down about 56% without us changing our habits. And that's due to the efficiency of battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. That's about 21%. The efficiency of electrified industry, about 4.3%. The efficiency of heat pumps is about 13.6%. And then most people don't realize that 11.3% of all energy worldwide is used to mine, transport, and refine fossil fuels and uranium. And so we eliminate all that because wind doesn't require any mining for the energy, and either does solar. And then 6.6% of energy efficiency beyond business as usual. So that adds up to 56% reduction of demand. So this shows the same thing, but in a timeline form. It shows from 2020 to 2050. If we don't do anything, we go along the top line. But if we electrify and provide the electricity with wind, water, solar, we go down those 5 shades of colors to the 100% WWS line for the reasons I just mentioned. That's 8.9 terawatts. And then we provide that 8.9 terawatts with just a combination of wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, etc. And this shows a transition of 80% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. But that would avoid 1.5 degrees global warming if we can transition worldwide everything and plus eliminate non-energy emissions simultaneously. And just to put that in perspective, about 90% of air pollution worldwide is due to energy, of anthropogenic air pollution is due to energy, and about 70 to 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions are due to energy. The rest are due to, well, biomass burning, which is not an energy, but it creates air pollution and global warming, as well as nitrous oxide from fertilizers, as well as methane from agriculture, such as rice paddies, digestive tracts of sheep and cattle, and manure, and landfills, and also halogens is another big source of non-energy emissions. But anyway, so that's one timeline. But if we can transition 80% by 2030, we should be able to transition 100% by 2035, at least in terms of new technologies. And this shows a faster transition timeline with the same endpoint in 2050. And that's this timeline is actually, I think we can accomplish if we really put our minds to it. Now, this shows the mix, the worldwide mix, and then we did individual mixes for each individual country, and also we did plans for each of the 50 states. This shows, like, worldwide, in 2050, a set of average mixes is 32% onshore wind, 13% offshore, 16% rooftop PV, utility PV is about 30%, 3% CSP, less than 1% geothermal, 5% hydro, all of which exists, and the rest tidal wave and heat, some heat. In the US, it's not too different. It's a little less onshore wind, more offshore wind, a little more rooftop solar, it's about the same amount of utility PV, etc. We go to California, a little less onshore wind, a little more offshore wind than the US average, a little more rooftop PV and utility PV and CSP, and geothermal electricity and hydro. Again, the hydro all exists already in all these cases. In any case, we develop plans for each entity. So you might ask, well, how much land does this take? Well, in the case of the world, well, offshore wind doesn't take up any new land. Tidal wave don't take up new land. Rooftop PV does not take up new land. We're not adding any new hydro. Geothermal land is really small. So it comes down to utility PV and CSP requires some new land, and that's what we call footprint, because you actually need that land, although there are ways to use that land for dual purposes, like elevated above agricultural land, for example, or over a canal or over a reservoir. And then onshore wind is really spacing between wind turbines. And you can use that that land for sure for multiple purposes, such as agriculture and even putting solar on it. Well, the onshore wind spacing worldwide is about 0.36%. Utility PV plus CSP footprints 1.17. So the total is 0.53% of world land. In the US, it's 0.84%. In California, about 0.8%. For comparison, the fossil fuel industry occupies 1.3% of US land area and 1.2% of California land area. So these plans would reduce the fossil fuel land area required, reduce the land area required compared with what's currently there. Even though nobody likes to add wind turbines, most people do not realize there are 1.3 million active oil and gas wells, 3.2 million abandoned oil and gas wells in the US, millions of miles of oil and gas pipelines, hundreds of thousands of gas stations. There are refineries, storage facilities, coal mines, all sorts of fossil fuel infrastructure that are polluting our land. Can we keep the grid stable? Yeah, we did grid stability analyses because I also, as I mentioned, do climate and air pollution weather modeling. And so I was able to predict the weather every 30 seconds for several years in 2050 throughout the world and use that data to as inputs into this grid integration model to see if we can keep the grid stable. And yes, we found that we can keep the grid stable everywhere in the world, in all 50 US states and all 145 countries examined. This shows California keeping the grid stable. This is 2 years straight for every 30 seconds, matching supply with demand and storage. The bottom graph just shows a 100-day period during this. You can see it so it's easier to see some of the data. So what's the cost of keeping the grid stable? The capital cost worldwide is about $62 trillion, in the US around 9, China around 13, and California about $500 billion. But there's a payback time of on the order of 6 years. So let me show you how that's calculated. So right now, fossil fuels cost the world about $11 trillion per year. That's how much we spend on our energy, for all energy. And that's expected to go up to around 17.8 trillion per year by 2050. Health costs in 2050 are estimated to be about 33.6 trillion, climate costs about 32 trillion, total social costs of 83 trillion per year due to fossil fuel infrastructure. If we go to wind, water, solar, we eliminate the health cost, we eliminate the climate cost of energy. Our fuel costs go down 63%. That's because of the 56% reduction of demand for energy, as I showed before, plus another 15% reduction in the cost per unit energy. So energy costs go down 63%, down to 6.6 trillion. Social costs go down 92%. So the difference between the energy cost of 17.8 and 6.6 is around $11 trillion. Divide $62 trillion by 11 trillion per year, and you've got a payback time of on the order of 5 to 6 years. And so again, this is financially, this is so beneficial. I can't say how much. It's so cost effective to do this transition, and it creates huge numbers of jobs, about 28 million long-term full-time jobs versus lost worldwide, and 3 to 4 million in the US. Okay, so the last part of this is policies. Well, our first energy plan was in 2009. It was actually a worldwide plan, and it was looking at could we actually power the entire world with wind, water, and solar for all purposes. And it was kind of more, because we didn't look at individual countries, it was more general, but it did look at large-scale numbers. And we concluded, yes, it's technically and economically possible. There are enough resources, there's enough land. The costs are higher now, but it's still reasonable. Higher back in 2009. It was possible to transition by 2030, but for social and political reasons, a more likely transition would be about 2050, with maybe 80% by 2030. Little did we know that this would be the scientific basis of the Green New Deal, which is a policy proposal that was introduced in the US Congress to go to 100% renewables by 2030. It's never got voted on. But there were eight resolutions and bills in Congress, both House and the Senate, between 2015 and 2019 for the US to go to 100% renewables. None were even voted on, though. But there are 62 countries that have committed, either through policies or laws, to 100% renewable electricity. There's only one country, Denmark, which was brought up at the beginning of this of the meeting. And Denmark's the only country that is actually committed to 100% renewables for all energy. So that's electricity, transportation, buildings, and industry. So one of the policies we do need to put in place is renewable portfolio standards, not only for electricity, but also for transportation, for buildings, and for industry, and transition timelines. That would be the most effective legislation. It's much, I found that people are much more likely to go for 100% renewables than to go for zero carbon. It's just a psychological thing. It's even though they accomplish the same thing, or even going to 100% renewables compared with a carbon tax. I mean, people would rather go to 100% in renewables. It's just a positive, uplifting thing than to pay a tax, even though they accomplish the same thing. Because 100% renewables, it eliminates fossil fuels to go to zero carbon, but it actually does more, because 100% renewables replaces fossil fuels. That means you eliminate the air pollution, as well as the carbon, as well as the land problems associated with the fossils. Whereas zero carbon or carbon tax, it only focuses on carbon. So, and you can pay a tax and still pollute and still emit carbon and get away with it. So this is why I strongly recommend, if you want to do advocacy, go for 100% renewables. And in fact, there are over 400 international companies, including 8 of the 10 biggest companies in the world, that have committed to 100% renewables across their global operations. Google and Apple and several others have actually reached that actually a few years ago. And so these companies, a lot of them are actually driving the transition, because they're actually building wind farms, solar farms, battery storage facilities, and electrifying their vehicle fleets, for example. There are laws and executive orders in 19 US states and territories to go to 100% renewable electricity. And again, this is only electricity, not transportation, buildings, and industry. In California, there are over 40 municipal laws banning natural gas in new buildings. So that's a step forward, but we need to electrify all buildings. And there are statewide rules to go to zero emission vehicles by 2035 in California, or it might be a little sooner, but I think the US was 2035. So that's good, but we really need aggressive policies put in place to go to 100% renewables for everything, and electrify everything, and provide the electricity with clean renewable sources. There are 180 US cities and counties committed to 100% renewables. A lot of these, the Sierra Club took our energy plans back in 2013 and started a whole movement to get cities to approve. A lot of other groups joined on board, but the result was 180 US cities have committed to 100% renewables, including several in Southern California. This just list a few of these cities. There are 14 countries with electricity generation between 90 and 100% wind, water, and solar. And these are listed on the left here. See, Albania, Bhutan, Iceland, Nepal, and Paraguay are all 100% wind, water, solar. And they're all dominated by hydro, the H. And the second major source is either solar or geothermal. And then there's Ethiopia, Congo, Norway, and Costa Rica, which are all above 98.5% about. And then Namibia, Uganda, Kenya, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan are above 90% wind, water, solar, mostly hydro again. Now, in the US, you wouldn't believe it, but South Dakota generates 120% of the electricity it consumes with just wind and hydro, mostly wind, 77% wind and the rest hydro. Washington State's at 97.2%, Montana's at 92.6%. I don't know how many of you heard of the Held versus Montana legal case where it was the first climate case in US history, and we won. I was an expert witness and went there to testify about how Montana could go to 100% renewables. And the state opposed this, trying to claim that, well, their emissions of carbon dioxide have little impact on the world. The judge disagreed and found that local, every ton of carbon dioxide that's emitted has an impact. And in fact, there are local impacts of the carbon dioxide that are emitted locally as well. But that's another story. Anyway, there are a lot of places where there are a lot of renewables have been put in, but again, in California itself is about 50% wind, water, solar in the annual average, but we still have a long way to go. So to summarize, transitioning the world should create about 28 million more long-term full-time jobs than lost, requires only about 0.53% of the world land for footprint and spacing, avoids over 7 million air pollution deaths per year, would slow and reverse global warming. We think we can keep the grid stable with wind, water, solar, with annual energy costs about 63% lower and social costs about 92% lower than with fossil fuels. And finally, if you want more information, here are some links. And with that, I will stop and leave it for questions if you have any. So,
Yes.
Thank you, Mark.
We
Yes,
do.
I'm going to kick off with the questions. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful presentation. So much great information in there. We have some questions that I pulled from our book club meeting that we had a few weeks ago. And I just wanted to kick it off with one. I mean, you talked a lot about what's going on in California. I mean, California seems to be one of the leaders in the world. What progress have we actually made, and are we on track to reach those goals? And then on another question, just to follow up, what additional policies might help 100% law to be effective?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, California is about 50% wind, water, solar in the annual average. It's some days, I mean, this year, some days we're over 100% wind, water, solar for 30 minutes, an hour. We're definitely over 90 to 95% for several hours, mostly on the weekends, on some days in the spring. But in the summer, it gets worse. But there is potential. I mean, especially solar is still growing. California battery storage is growing. We really need offshore wind because solar is great during the day, but then the sun goes down, and that's when the natural gas kicks in right now. Now, batteries are starting to for a few hours, are starting to kick in right after sunset. But offshore wind, the nice thing about offshore wind, especially in Northern California, is it peaks in summer and it peaks in the late afternoon, early evening. So it's perfect for solving that the solar problem where the solar is going down at night. So we really need to push for more for our first offshore wind. Now, part of the offshore wind problem or lack of offshore wind is that the only place that has a huge transmission cable to the coast is where Diablo Canyon nuclear plant is. And so because of the extension of Diablo Canyon, that's basically slowed down or stopped the growth of offshore wind off there, which is one of the two locations in California where the Biden administration was proposing to put a lot of offshore wind. And that's now going to be delayed because Diablo Canyon is hogging that transmission cable to the coast. It's basically 2 or 3 gigawatts worth of power in Diablo Canyon. So in terms of policies, there's a 100% renewable policy through SB 100 in California for electric power, but we need the same for transportation, buildings, and industry. Now, there is a goal, as I mentioned, for California to go to 100% or to go to basically all electric vehicles by, I think it was around 2035. But that should be sped up because electric vehicles are here today. And so all new vehicles should be 100%, should be all electric, by 2026, not 2035. And then in buildings, more aggressive policies, not only to make sure throughout the state of California, all new homes are electrified, purely electric, have no gas going into them at all, but we need to retrofit existing homes as fast as possible, and apartments and all other buildings. And then industry is the fourth prong, where we need to electrify industry as well and go to alternate, like cement production processes, either geopolymer or using basalt, as I mentioned. So those are some ideas.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Robert Mason. Robert, would you mind coming off mute and ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mark, in our book group, we came up with some questions, and so here's my question to you. Do you see a way to get people to reframe their perspective towards science? It's amazing how many people in neighborhoods that just don't trust science. People who are untrusting of science. So this is not a science. I mean, it's a science issue, but it's much bigger than a science issue. So can you address that, please?
Yeah. So a lot of people don't believe in global warming, and you can't convince them. They don't believe that climate's a problem. But it's interesting. I saw this public opinion poll a few years ago where there's actually 26,000 people in 13 countries, including the US, and only like 59% of the people believed in global warming in this poll. But 82% on average, including in the US, believed that the US and other countries should go to 100% renewable energy. So it was interesting that they believed in transitioning to renewables, but not in global warming, which is fine with me, because if you believe in the solution but not the problem, that's good enough. Because the key is to actually implement the solution. And so I would, that's what I would focus on is, okay, how do we solve the problem, not debate people if the problem exists. And most people, the reason a lot of people like renewables, even though they might not believe in global warming, is because it saves them money, it creates jobs, it creates energy independence. And there are a lot of people who are very conservative, for example, who like renewables because it allows them to own their own power, and so they don't get government interference. So if trying to understand people's motivations and what does drive them, I think helps. And I think that's why renewables is a very positive thing. I mean, if you look at the states in the US that have the highest wind penetrations, I mean, they aren't California, and they aren't 9 of the 10 states with the highest fraction of their electricity from wind are all red states. It's because it's so cheap. It's not because there are policies in those states. Those states do not have policies to go to wind. They just have a lot of wind, and it's so cheap. So this is the key, is to focus on the solution, I think, rather than what are the problems. But I agree, people don't want to hear science if it doesn't agree with their philosophy.
Thank you for that. Vivian Deutsch, could you come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, I actually have 2 questions. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you can.
Yes.
Okay, the first is, these plans are amazing.
Well, thank you.
You have everything down to the last detail, but how is this getting implemented in the US and around the world? Like we just heard about Denmark. Denmark, they're doing it. Where else are people actually, do they have plans with deadlines, with, you know what I'm saying? With concrete.
Well, I mean, I think they're
Actually, not aspirational. Wait, that's one question. And my second question is about China. China is a weird conundrum because on the one hand, they're the biggest coal users, and on the other hand, they have all these 5-year plans to, go on to renewable energies, and they're producers of renewable energy equipment. So I wanted to ask you what you know about, are they going to get off of coal? Are they really going to do it?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of movement. I mean, the G20, I mean, a lot of it might be talk, but the G20 just committed to tripling the amount of renewable energy worldwide by 2030. Now, that's not as fast as we want, but it is a positive step. I mean, and there are a lot of, as I mentioned, there are actually 45 countries that are over 50% wind, water, solar in their electric power. And there's a lot of push in the European Union, for example, and also in the US for heat pumps in other places. I mean, in Maine, the state of Maine last year alone added 100,000 heat pumps, electric heat pumps. France added like 3 million or something, but proportionally, Maine actually added more than France. Norway and Sweden and Finland dominate heat pumps. So I mean, almost I think it's like 30% of all their homes have heat pumps in them already. So the growing technologies, electric vehicles, heat pumps, induction cooktops. These are the things that need to be, are just low hanging fruit that could be implemented pretty rapidly if we put our mind to it. But which countries? There are a lot of individual countries, a lot of states, some that I mentioned, that are working, and a lot in California is going on too. I mean, adding 5 gigawatts of batteries in 2 years, that's more than anywhere in the world. So California has done a lot. China is doing a huge amount too. I mean, they're putting in like almost 2/3 of all the global renewables this year will be from China. I mean, it's just it's enormous. It's like more renewables are coming in 1 year than like almost all the other countries combined. And that's as a result, the cost of the worldwide average cost of wind is now half. It was like 50 cents a watt because of China's spending so much on wind. It's just the economies of scale, and it's so cheap to do it, which you're not going to see here. Here it's like $1 a watt for onshore wind, but it's that the average worldwide is. So they're doing a lot. Hopefully they'll phase out coal. I don't know what their actual deadlines are because even though they grow a lot with renewables, they do keep coal around, and that's still a major source. So I can't really answer when they're going to get rid of it, but I just know that eventually, if you're going to keep adding as much as they're adding right now, it has to go down at some point pretty soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Diana, I believe you had a question. And you're on mute.
I'm going to ask a two-parter. So this is pie in the sky. If you had $1 billion, where would you spend it? Where do you think it would do the most good?
Well, I would implementing renewables. So so more solar, more wind, heat pumps, electric vehicles, and electric induction. Those are the lowest hanging fruit, and energy efficiency, of course, and putting LED lights. So those will all reduce energy use. I would just dump it into the most basic things. Every new heat pump you put in, every new solar panel or wind turbine you put in, it's just going to reduce emissions. So we just need to deploy everything as fast as possible.
And I just wanted to tack onto that. I'm curious what kind of projects the Solutions Project, the nonprofit that you have with Mark Ruffalo, what types of projects are you guys working on? And if you want to later, if you can.
So the Solutions Project I co-founded in 2013 with Mark Ruffalo and a couple other people, Josh Fox and Marco Krapels, and it started as a group his goal was to transition or to take our energy plans that we were developing for states at the time and educate the public and policymakers about them. And actually that's what helped to get all these state laws in place. I mean, SB 100 and New York's law, in fact, all those 19 state laws resulted from the combination, taking our energy plans and then we had 100 nonprofits join on board. And it was really because nobody's listening to me alone, but when you have community leaders, when you have business leaders, you have cultural leaders. So it was really science, business, culture, and community working together. That's what got the information out to large numbers of people. And then lots of other nonprofits joined on board, including the Sierra Club and NRDC and Greenpeace and 350 and Climate Reality too, helped along with this. But there are literally 100. And so with all these people on the ground, that's how we got all these state laws passed. But over time, the Solutions Project kind of started migrating toward, because there was an executive director who joined it and was starting to lead it. And then it kind of started going in a different direction to focus on communities. So that's what they're doing right now, is really focusing on individual communities and trying to elevate people and communities to try to go to 100% renewable, but we're not doing state plans. So I'm not haven't been too much involved with it lately, but I'm still support it, and they still support our work.
Thank you.
Sharon, I believe you had a question.
I do, and maybe this is a bit off the wall, but it seems like we, at least in California and the US, are still fairly early in our energy transition. But my question is about unintended consequences of that transition. So we started to see that as a result of the 2020 changes in shipping regulations, that there was a lot less air pollution over the Atlantic Ocean, and now it's starting to seem like maybe that 80% reduction in sulfur particles actually led to warming of the ocean due to less cloud cover. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about that, or what other unintended consequences we might anticipate as we start to make our energy transition more rapid.
Well, I wouldn't call them unintended consequences. I mean, we know that half of global warming is masked by air pollution. So I'd say they're known consequences.
Yes.
But yeah, so I mean, the reason our temperatures aren't much higher is because of air pollution that's killing people. I mean, those same particles, primarily because particles cause most of the obstruction of the sun, that cause health damage. Most of them reduce temperatures. But there are some particles, black and brown carbon, that cause warming, but there are a lot more particles that cause cooling. So we have to eliminate these particles due to for health reasons alone. So we want to eliminate those particles. And so we're going to expect temperatures to rise before they fall. But we need to eliminate these particles. But if we eliminate them simultaneously with the greenhouse gases while transitioning to renewable energy, and that's what will happen, we will get, ultimately, temperatures will drop and things will get better, but things will get worse before they get better. And so it's still a necessary step to stop those pollution particles. And we have to do it because those are the worst parts of air pollution health.
Great, thank you. Don, do you have a question?
Yes. Let's see.
I just want to encourage everybody to go ahead. If you have any questions, to please put them in the chat, and then we will raise them.
So we live in a fossil fuel culture, and our entire society is built on it. And over the years, there have been many new technologies in the past that have caught on really quickly because they benefited society, like cell phones, the telegraph, indoor plumbing, and they all took off really quickly. But the technologies we are looking after, the ones we want, are not so obviously, do not have a value that's not so obvious, like electric vehicles, induction cooktops, and heat pumps. What I hear a lot is, what we've got is fine, why change? So do you have any ideas on how to promote the new technologies we need to move our culture in the right direction?
Well, I think the most obvious is financial, because a lot of people, things work with fossil fuels. If you don't really care about climate or pollution, then why not just keep burning fuel and do what we're doing? So either people are motivated by pollution and climate and energy security, or they're motivated by cost. And so, but it is more cost effective. Heat pumps cost a whole lot less than gas heaters. Electric vehicles cost a whole lot less than combustion vehicles. Electric vehicles do. And so I think the more that information gets out there, the more people who don't care about the pollution or climate are interested to change. So I think that's the message is, electric vehicle, it's more than just cost. It has less repairs, they're safer, they're quieter. The only disadvantage has been range, but even that's been eroded. Tesla actually just introduced its 50,000th supercharging station. That's supercharging, not just supercharging station in the world over 10 years. So charging stations, other electric car companies have a lot of charging stations as well. That's growing. Things are moving, but they are moving too slow. In some countries, as I mentioned, the heat pumps, there are hundreds of thousands of heat pumps going in every year. But in other places, it's much slower. So there's a lot of regional change, but we do need, mostly information, I think, about costs and the benefits.
Diane, I know we're almost at time, but I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions if you want to read something from the chat.
Yes, from Cherry Robinson, who is from another Climate Reality chapter. Cherry asks, there are many stances being taken by the CPUC to minimize and stop rooftop solar. How do we change that?
Well, I think it's mostly the utilities pushing this, because the utilities see rooftop solar as competition. And because, you know, people have rooftop solar, they use most of that solar for their own use. And so they're not buying grid electricity. And so they're trying to make it more expensive. Now, rooftop solar is very beneficial because, first of all, it reduces the need for transmission lines. And transmission line sparks have caused wildfires, not only in California, but also now in Maui. And so these are utility caused big fires. And it's to everybody's benefit to have more rooftop solar to minimize those fires. Plus, rooftop solar, you use your own energy. If there's a blackout, you have your own energy available if you have a battery. And you can, it just cheapens your electricity too when you're not using as much electricity. So I think it's really, again, when people are aware of what the benefits are, there's less pushback. The PUC is really just, I mean, I don't think they care one way or the other. They're just getting pushed on all directions by the utilities, who are really the ones who I think are the ones at fault here.
Okay. A question from Karen. I'm in the local GWP STAG, and they currently say that solar panels are too expensive to even factor into renewables. They say wind is cheaper, but they refuse to go to rooftop and utility solar.
Right, who's that? Who's that who refuses?
That
GWP, here the Glendale Water and Power.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they do what you just said because it's a competition to what they have to offer, right?
Yeah.
They wouldn't make the money, and they just don't even include it. We want it, and they said no, we don't want to even. It's not feasible because it's way too expensive.
Yeah, I mean, well, so I would recommend, like, there are a lot of community choice aggregation utilities in California, and there's probably one I'm sure there's one there in Glendale. I mean, we have. And they're like an alternative. So they would, like, in where I live, Silicon Valley Clean Energy is a community choice aggregation utility. So they take over, if I sign up with them, they take over the generation portion of the bill. And PG&E still does the transmission distribution. So if I have rooftop solar, I can sell it to my Silicon Valley Clean Energy. And so I'm not dealing with PG&E, PG&E is the one who's trying to prevent the rooftop solar from going in. But it is a fight. I mean, you really have to fight back against these utilities because they will fight tooth and nail. I mean, and they'll also not tell the truth because they'll say, well, the rooftop solar is taking their business. But when you have, in the future in California, we're going to have to electrify everything. That means our electricity demand is going to double. Even though the total energy demand goes down on the order of 60%, right now, electricity is 20% of end use energy. So let's say we have 100 units of energy today, 20 units is electricity. If we go to wind, water, solar, we only need 40 units of energy because we go down 60 units, but all that's electricity. So we double the electricity, we reduce all energy. So even if a good portion of that's rooftop solar, the utilities will have much more grid electricity than today. So they'll be making money. So it's just not, the main argument they say is that, oh, we're going to have less electricity to sell, and it's not true. They're going to have more electricity to sell because we're electrifying everything.
A question from Polly Estabrook. She asks, if we don't have the political will to fight the corporations, do you think we should turn to geoengineering, such as seeding atmosphere with dust or deep ocean iron fertilization?
No, not at all, because that doesn't help solve the problem. That just masks the problem. That's like the pollution particles that I was mentioning. It's just a mask. I mean, so the problem just continues. We need to focus on eliminating emissions. And, companies, except for the oil companies, the companies that are in energy, most companies are actually want to transition. I gave you a list. There are 400 international companies, including most of the biggest companies, that have committed to 100% renewables. So it's not most of the companies, it's the companies like Exxon and Chevron and all these oil and gas companies that are trying, and the utilities that are really holding things back. So, but they're a very small number of companies, but they're very powerful in terms of this issue.
Great. Well, we should probably wrap it up and we just have, I think, another one question, maybe two at the most. But Mark, I want to defer to you. It's coming up to 8:30. So
Yeah, I really have to run. So maybe one more question.
okay, Michelle, go ahead.
Wayne, I think you had a question. Wayne, if you don't mind coming off mute.
Yes. Hi, Professor Jacobson. I read your book and was really impressed at the knowledge that you had. You mentioned about brown carbon as being one of the major causes of heating. And I wonder, are there any immediate solutions, something that we can implement quickly to reduce the brown carbon?
Yeah, well, black carbon is like diesel soot exhaust, and brown carbon is organic carbon. That's it could be brown or yellow or orange, like mostly from more lower temperature flames. Higher temperature flames give you black carbon, slightly lower temperature flames, brown carbon. So, well, the biggest source of black carbon is diesel exhaust. So, yeah, particle traps. But I mean, again, though, is it worth putting a trap versus just going to an electric vehicle instead? But in the interim, particle traps on ships, on diesel exhaust in vehicles, trucks, buses. California's done a good job of trying to do that. And there's also kerosene burning, but also biomass burning. So reducing biomass burning. In the last year in Brazil, biomass burning actually went down quite a bit. And that saved a lot of pollution, a lot of black carbon, brown carbon, and also carbon dioxide in trees.
Great. So thank you so much for being with us tonight. And this is a tough subject, and you covered so much. It's complex, but I think we all appreciated the detail that you provided for us. So this is where we ask everybody to turn off their mic and just express gratitude and thank you for being with us tonight. So thank you so much, and thank you, Michelle, for
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I
Thank
appreciate it.
Yeah. Positive
Thank
you.
outlook.
Thank you.
Count us in as part of your team, okay?
Okay, well, I'm glad you guys are all active in this area. This really makes me feel good. Thank you.
Good. Great. Thank you so much.
Good
And
night.
everyone,
All
go
right, take care.
the line. Thanks again.
Bye.